There are some amazing watercolour brushes available for Procreate now, and I want to see if I can use them to replicate my usual watercolour style on the iPad. Hello, my name is Danny Williams. I'm an illustrator specialising in natural history posters and prints created with traditional watercolours. But these days I find myself increasingly leaning towards Procreate for its convenience and the fact that I just really enjoy using it. I've got some examples here of the wildlife illustrations that I created with paints and fine liner pens. I tend to work the watercolours wet on wet and embrace the bleeds and blooms and any granulation that happens in the painting. Those are the sort of gorgeous, slightly out of control watercolour textures that I love. The animals overall, though, are usually quite detailed because the pen lines are there to hold all that mess in place. Today, for this experiment, I'm going to draw an animal that I've painted lots of times in the past and one that I'm quite familiar with, and that is a shark. Now obviously I could sketch directly onto the iPad, but I already have a sketchbook full of sharks that I've not got around to painting yet, so I'm just going to snap a photo of one of these with the iPad and import that image straight into Procreate. I want to approach this picture in the same way I'd approach a traditional painting, and the next step in that process would be to go over the sketch with a very thin fine liner pen. For this I'm going to use the dry ink brush that comes with Procreate, and I'm going to select a dark grey, not full black. And I'm working on a layer above the canvas texture because I don't want this part of the picture to be affected by the textures in that canvas. Actually, I wasn't happy with that first pen sketch, so I'm just going over it in a new layer to tidy it up and just improve it. With a real pen, the rough texture of the watercolour paper would sort of break up the line, and I'd work in quite a sketchy, scratchy way rather than doing bold, sweeping movements or applying a lot of pressure. So I'm trying to work in a similar way here to get the same effect. This is an oceanic white-tip shark, by the way. They're a beautiful and really distinctive looking shark with these enormous paddle-like pectoral fins. They're also one of the potentially dangerous sharks as far as humans are concerned, but they live offshore in deeper waters, so most of us are unlikely to ever encounter one. Okay, with the outline done, I'm moving on to the colour, and I'm going to do this on a new layer underneath the canvas texture layers. I've bought several sets of watercolour brushes that work in similar ways. I definitely recommend those by Drifter Studio, Lisa Glanz or Julia Dreams. Today I'll probably use a mixture of those, but any set on its own is great. This shark has a pale underside, but I don't want it to just be the white of the paper, so I'm going to start by applying a very pale colour just to cover the whole animal, and I'm using a watercolour brush by Julia Dreams. This colour is actually a little bit too dark, but it doesn't matter because I can just tweak that once I'm done. Now at this point I'm just laying down the colour. I don't care if I go over the lines because with such a simple shape it's easy enough to go around the edge and erase anything that I need to. And that's actually exactly what I do with a real watercolour painting. Although it can be done in Photoshop, I found that the best way to cut out the animal from its background and tidy up any areas when I've gone outside the lines is to use Procreate. Now I'm adding a new layer above this base colour, and I've set it to clipping mask so that anything on this layer will only be visible in the areas that have already been painted on that layer below. I'm using a pale warm grey and I'm just blocking out the colour. Along the bottom edge I'm being a little more careful to try and create a realistic looking watercolour edge and preserve that white belly, but around the rest of the shark I don't need to worry about going over the lines because it's set to clipping mask. I'm also not worried about these streaky areas where I've lifted the pencil and gone over myself because I'm going to blend those out in a minute. If you're buying a watercolour brush set, look for one that includes a water blender. You use them in the brush mode rather than the Procreate blend mode, and you can blend out any streaks or blend colours together in a realistic way that preserves that watercolour texture. And I'm also using that watercolour blender just to tease out these spots of colour on the fins and make it look like watercolour paint that has been worked wet on wet and has been allowed to bleed out into the water. Now I just want to darken the edges a little. I'll work on another layer which will allow me to tweak the intensity of these colours, and I'll set it to multiply. Firstly, I'm using a textured watercolour brush from Lisa Glanz just to darken up some areas around the fins and around the back of the shark. And again, this layer is set to clipping mask, so it will only show up over that base layer. And because this is an oceanic white tip shark, I'm going to use that same textured brush just to erase the grey colour from the tips of the fins, and it gives a lovely textured edge to the colour. Now I want to add a little bit of colour variation, not too much, and I'm going to use a textured stamp this time. These are actually really easy and fun to make yourself, but this is one that came in Lisa Glanz's watercolour set. And I'm just going to add some hints of yellow, which will blend in with the warm grey. And you can play around with the blending modes and the opacity of that layer to get the right effect. Now, if I were working in traditional watercolour, there's one last step to my process, and that is to add some pencil shading. So again, on a new layer, which I'm putting above the canvas texture, I'm going to use one of the Procreate pencils and a very pale grey just to pick out areas of shadow and give the shark a little depth. Just adding that anywhere where I think the light might be not catching as much, any areas that might be in shadow. And I think he's done. If I just toggle off the various layers, you can see that I've got the fine liner pen and the pencil layers above the canvas, and then below it I've got 2 layers of colour and texture variation and the grey paint layer, and at the very bottom that pale layer that covered the whole shark. The canvas that I'm using is one that came with a watercolour brush set. It adds the paper texture to the whole document, but it also includes layers that help to create more of a watercolour look to the painted areas. And if I turn these layers off, you can see what a huge difference they make to the picture. I'm quite happy with how this shark looks, but let's add a scan of one that I created previously with real watercolours to compare the two. There is a difference, but it's not a bad match. The real test, I think, will be to see them printed out side by side. So here's my finished shark print. I've seen 5 of these species in real life. 4 of them here were made with Procreate, and the rest were painted with real watercolours. Now for those 4 that were done digitally, using Procreate was a massive time saver. Obviously they're quite small here in this print, but I think even if they were printed at a much larger size, it would be quite hard to tell the difference. I'll leave details in the description of the brush sets that I used today, and if you can tell which 4 sharks were created digitally, leave a comment and let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.